On January 10th, Russian authorities confirmed a Ukrainian strike on an oil depot in Volgograd, Russia, a city 440 kilometers, 273 miles behind the front lines. Now, Moscow had just the day before tried to seize the narrative by showing its strength. On January 9th, the Kremlin claimed it fired a Oreshnik hypersonic missile. Now, the speed of that missile is impressive 13,600 kilometers per hour, 8,450 miles per hour. But strategically, it's wholly irrelevant because speed does not fix a broken fuel network. Missiles win headlines, however, it's fuel that wins wars. Fuel and cash flow decides if Russia can fight next month. There are two different strategies currently at play in this war. There's the strategy of Ukraine, which is making it impossible for Russia to wage war. And then there's the strategy of Russia, which attacks across Ukraine and sends more of its own men off to meet assaults. But at the end of the day, only one of these strategies is strategic. The other one is just tactics, which are clearly losing. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post and a national security advisor. In today's intelligence briefing, we're going to go through exactly what is going on and how it is changing not just this war, but what we see going on globally. If you'd like to get more updates that are more than the headlines about what's really going on, the real analysis, then please subscribe to this channel today. Thank you. So first and foremost, we have to understand that depot fires force rerouting, which causes delays and shortages. The missile talk that we hear from Russia, though, its objective is different. It's to push for Western hesitation, not for battlefield advantage. But the hardest constraint is the one that Moscow cannot hide, and that's the price of oil that we see. As you know, oil revenue for Russia is simply the oxygen on which it survives. But today, given the current prices, Russia is suffocating. On January 8th, Urals crude traded for about $50.88 per barrel. Now, Russia's 2025 budget assumed a price of nearly $70 per barrel. That creates a gap of almost $19 on every barrel sold. That gap represents a 27% drop below the budget assumption. The state is collecting a quarter less revenue than it had initially planned. And now, there's something else here that's very important. We can note the strain in Russia by looking at their budget revisions, which are public. So take a look at this. Before even having the drones finish their job, we see that the original 2025 plan expected $136 billion in oil and gas taxes. That's downgraded from the forecast that had already been slashed to about $107 billion, meaning that there's $29 billion cut from the war budget. That sum is roughly equal to 20% of Russia's entire annual military budget. It is nearly equal to the total annual budget for internal security and police inside of Russia. But today, that money is simply gone. But the regime is trying to plug this hole in any way they can. It's trying to find a solution. But when oil disappears and there's simply no revenue, the Kremlin's only solution is to print more money to pay the army. But printing money, that has its problems. It triggers an inflationary spiral. Prices for food, spare parts, and medicine are skyrocketing in Russia, and this breaks the core social contract of Vladimir Putin's rule. The deal was very simple. You stay out of politics, and I keep your fridge full. I will keep you safe. But inflation is emptying the fridge. Every time a refinery burns, the price of eggs in Moscow goes up, and that is a threat the secret police cannot arrest. But that's another problem. There are strikes across Russia. How does the social contract of I will protect you work when today you see drones flying by you on your way to work? People are not very happy to see this. They're very worried. But there's something else that worries the Kremlin. Buyer leverage is the real nuclear deterrent. And at this point, it is something that's absolute. Moscow today likes to use things like Oreshnik to intimidate the West, to make the West think that a third world war might start at any point, that a nuclear escalation could be at hand. But Moscow threats stay verbal because their partners demand their silence. China and India are the only reason that the Russian economy is still breathing. Both nations have a hard red line on nuclear use. Now, for India, nuclear normalization is simply a nightmare. If Russia breaks the nuclear taboo, it emboldens Pakistan and China. A nuclear strike would force India to dump Russian oil instantly. Now, for China, a Russian nuke is a strategic disaster. Beijing wants a stable partner, not a radioactive pariah state next to it. And a nuclear strike would force the U.S. to pivot its full weight into Asia. And that is the one outcome that China is desperate to avoid. All of this creates a buyer veto, let's call it. And that's something that Vladimir Putin simply cannot ignore. If he uses his nuclear weapons or uses an Oreshnik in Europe, the oil buyers will simply exit. And if the oil buyers exit, the revenue stops. And if the revenue stops, then his regime dies. Speaking of which, it reminds me, please see the first pinned comment below where it has the question of the day. Right underneath it, you'll see how you too can make a donation to help the Ukrainian soldiers get what they need to come back alive and other equipment necessary for Ukraine to defeat Russia. Ukraine, the soldiers, and I greatly appreciate your support. Now, Ukraine is routinely hitting the engine room of Russia, and it's doing it repetitively, time and again. And by doing this repetitively, it's changed how this war has been fought. Typical operations now use about 20 to 30 explosive drones plus decoys. Larger fleets force a defensive overload inside of Russia. Clausewitz, the military strategist, called this the center of gravity. Russia's center is fuel, throughput, and revenue. Fuel nodes matter because rail, armor, and aviation depend on steady flow. Depot fires impose a timing tax on every truck and every rail car. The damage, though, today for Russia is something else. Crude oil is useless to a tank until it is refined, and that process happens in specific towers called the cracking units. These units are custom built, high tech, and often Western designed. Now, Russia cannot replace these towers because of sanctions. Repair that used to take weeks can now take years. And when a drone hits a cracking unit, it doesn't just pause production, it permanently deletes the capacity for the duration of the war. Now, what's interesting is that the United States, going back already several months, has been helping Ukraine to carry out attacks within Russia to better target the Russian facilities that have oil. It's very important to note that these attacks, though, they're not being done just by the Ukrainians in isolation. In fact, today, it looks like it is the White House supporting them. This recently came out in the New York Times and the Washington Post that is the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which helps the Ukrainians to plan these attacks on Russian oil facilities, how to make them more aggressive and more effective to make sure that Russia is brought to its knees. Now, this is a very positive step. This is a sign that we're not so worried about escalation anymore. In fact, Putin's ongoing threats of escalation are something that we should all ignore. We've seen time and again that Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, comes out to threaten the West, to say that at any point there could be a nuclear escalation, that European capitals could be destroyed. And they use props such as Oreshnik to make that argument. The fact of the matter is, if they cannot take the city of Pokrovsk after already more than 2 years of battle, a town that had less than 65,000 people, why would you possibly think that they would want to start a war with NATO? A war, a hot war that they obviously could never hope to win. The fact is that Russia does not want that. Russia does this because it's trying to do something else. It's reflexive control. It is trying to signal to the West that there could be an escalation. That escalation is why the West should not help Ukraine. That is their actual objective. It is not about having sort of a military gain on the battlefield. That's something that's already too far away for them. But the ongoing attacks that Ukraine is carrying out, they are changing the war. Look at the attacks that we saw at the Timurok port. That port's over 2,000 square meters or 21,500 square feet. The repeated attacks by Ukraine are making it harder and harder for Russia to not only repair, but to continue operating as a country. New strikes forced rework and relocation, and the Soviet war in Afghanistan turned into a convoy war because the rear became the battlefield. Volgograd confirms the pattern is now moving deeper, and it's certainly not fading. But there's something else that's very important. Oreshnik was all about signaling, but signaling, it does not help Russia to win this war. It can only hope to slow down Ukraine's advance. Let's consider the fact that today we see that there is an effort by Russia to give these Oreshniks to Belarus. What's the real purpose of that? What is their objective? Once again, it is just to create tension in the West, to distract from the fact that today Ukraine's strategy of attacking within Russia is working successfully. The only hope that the Kremlin has is to convince people in the West that Russia will win or that Russia will become more aggressive. But the reality is today that Russia cannot win this war. Today, Vladimir Putin is looking at a world where he has very few good options. He sees that his tankers, a part of the shadow network around the world, are being captured. He sees that the price for oil is dropping. He sees that his allies in Tehran and in Caracas are falling. And then he looks domestically. He sees that the elites are at war with each other. He sees that the intelligence service is destroying the military. And at no point are things going well for Russia. For Russia, things will not get better. In fact, the Kremlin today is facing a fatal trilemma. They have 3 priorities, but only enough money for 2. There's priority 1, which is the war, the guns. There's priority 2, which is the regime's guards. But there's priority 3, the economy. And they must choose who gets paid and who gets stiffed. And if the war is starved, the front is lost. If the police are starved, the streets are lost. And if the economy is starved, the machine stops running. An internal war for the remaining rubles has already started inside of Russia. And history proves that unpaid bills can kill regimes faster than battles. In fact, Germany in 1918 is the perfect warning. Their army was still fighting on foreign soil, but the home front collapsed because the state ran out of resources. The government couldn't feed the workers or pay the police. Loyalty evaporated the moment that the checks bounced. But that's why we should be looking for different cracks. We should be seeing in their system how it's all coming undone. We can look at the indicators such as the factories that are being closed now indefinitely, or look for the fact that the soldiers' families are increasingly complaining that they're not getting their benefits. Look at the fact that, yes, intimidation by the police is very cheap. However, this cannot go on forever, especially when you cannot afford to pay the police. The war could very well end, though, due to the fact that physics will eventually take over politics. It's not going to be forever that Russia could continue starving on fuel. The front line is grinding to a halt because the tanks are running dry. And without diesel, a superpower becomes a statue. Today, Vladimir Putin is facing very few good choices. On one front, he has to pay for the war, because if he doesn't, the front will break. On another front, he must pay for domestic security, because if he doesn't, his regime could be toppled. But then there's a third front, the national economy. If he doesn't pay for that, the entire show is up. But today, Vladimir Putin cannot afford all three of those at the same time. They're simply too expensive. We see increasingly inside of Russia soldiers complaining they're not getting their pay. Their families complaining that the pay is not sufficient given the inflation. We see increasingly inside of Russia that factories that are closed just temporarily are now being changed to closed indefinitely. These are all signs that there are serious problems inside of Russia. All signs that Vladimir Putin's intimidation is very cheap, but at the end of the day, a riot policeman cannot be paid with propaganda. He wants to get paid in cash. And when the state is no longer able to pay cash, that's when you start to have serious problems. In fact, we've seen this before in history. Napoleon didn't just lose because he forgot how to fight. He lost because his supply line snapped. He marched an army deeper than his logistics could follow. Russia is now doing the same thing in reverse. They can threaten the West forever, but they cannot refill burned tanks forever. Today, for Russia, the situation has become more complex because Vladimir Putin himself has driven this country into the rut. Russia has no ability to get out of this. Today, the situation will only get worse as its allies globally begin to disappear. So in the coming weeks, make sure you check out what's happening inside of Russia, because when you see what's happening inside North Korea, it gets no better. Please click the video below. It really helps this channel. Thank you. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.